righty, welcome to BIMS Dives. I'm Dr. Tiara Moore, founder and CEO of Black and Marine Science. And today we're diving into capturing the ocean with Inka Cresswell. The conversation will be moderated by our Chief Operations Officer, Leslie Townsell, and our Chief Innovation Officer, Dr. Jeanette Davis. Inka Cresswell has a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology and is a wildlife filmmaker photographer. She uses her camera to educate the general public and about marine conservation issues, reconnects people with nature, and works to change people's perspectives of some of our most misunderstood species. She hopes that her work will not only educate and inspire a new generation of conservationists, but arm them with the tools they need to educate others and drive real conservation impact. And we are so excited to talk with her more about that today. I'll turn it over to you, Leslie.
Hi, Inka. Thank you so much for joining us. So earlier today, we actually asked our audience members over social media what their favorite method of capturing the ocean was, such as photography, videography, art, or writing, all of which captures the beauty of the ocean. At the end of the chat, we'll go over a couple of answers, but for now, can you tell us your favorite method of capturing the ocean and your favorite piece of equipment related to that method? And like I said, these can include photography, videography, art, writing, or anything that really captures the beauty of the ocean.
My favorite method is by far film. I think the reason that it really stands out to me is that it allows you to not only share beautiful imagery that really entices people into the beauty of the underwater world, but it also allows you to really educate people about the science, about the people who are working with those organisms, but also really kind of share that emotional attachment that we have. And I think when you can tell an emotional story with your images and through your art, you can capture people's hearts as well as their minds, which is really important when you want to drive conservation. So for when I'm working on films, my number one piece of equipment is my camera. And I'm very fortunate that I work with a fantastic camera that has an underwater housing, which is the S1H by Lumix Panasonic. And the reason that I chose that camera for the work that I do is that it allowed me to deliver both on photography needs and also film needs. And a lot of the work that I've done in the past, I often partner with different scientists and with organizations. So there's often data collection needs to what I'm capturing, as well as producing kind of content for social media or for film festivals or for my own independent projects. So I might need to take ID photos of the species that they're going to tag, or I might need to be covering behind the scenes, but then I might also need to be taking photos that would be for a magazine. So there's kind of all different things that are coming into play on one dive. So that's why I love that camera, is it's so versatile and it allows me to kind of think about all of those things at once and hopefully capture them in as many different formats as possible.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, you said a mouthful. You've done so much in this arena. And once again, we truly thank you for being with us today. We know that there's a time difference in where you are versus where we are. So thank you again for taking this time out. And speaking of film and videography and photography, which is really a unique aspect of being in this field of marine science, how did you get your start?
I started out very much, my love of the ocean started rock pooling. So I'm from Brighton on the south coast of England, and I was very fortunate that my backyard was the beach. And I used to go and wander along the beach all the time with my parents. And after a storm would roll through, you would find mermaids' egg cases, mermaids' passes, all sorts of shark egg cases, and other just really interesting things. So I kind of just had this natural curiosity about our oceans and became completely fixated. So from the age of about 5 or 6, I had decided that I was going to be a marine biologist. I wanted to know what all of this stuff was. I wanted to know how it works. And I was just completely obsessed with our oceans. But it was actually when I was at university, I moved to California when I was 18 to study marine biology. And it was when I was living out there and doing my degree that I just realized that a lot of the scientific papers I was reading, I felt like a lot of the solutions for the issues we were seeing in our oceans were there, but they weren't connecting with people. And I found it really, really frustrating kind of seeing all of the science and then seeing all of these people and not seeing the level of action that I wanted. And I always loved photography. And I realized that through my camera, my friends who weren't marine biology majors, who had no interest in the ocean, I could show them some of my photos that I would take snorkeling, and they would suddenly be like, wait, that's there? We can go see that? That's really a thing? And my camera was just so much more effective than any paper that I would put together or any presentation I would give. If I could show the imagery, then people's attention was so much more so grabbed. And I really felt like that was just such an effective method. So I then started using my photography more and more. I started incorporating it more into my degree, and then decided that that was what I wanted to be doing full time, is working more on the science communication side of things. So I was actually very lucky that I met a fantastic guy called William Winram at one of his talks, and I went and chatted with him about his work. And he's an amazing freediver. He's a world champion who dives to over 100 meters on one breath of air, which is something I would never be able to achieve. But what's even more incredible than that is that he freedives down to those depths and then tags great white sharks. And I was talking to him and I was just like, I want to be able to do that. And he took me on board as an apprentice for his project, the Waterman Project. So I spent some time working with them, documenting all of their research efforts. And one thing led to another. And eventually I had built my portfolio enough that I could go and do a master's in wildlife filmmaking. And that's how I really got my bigger break into doing more documentaries and more photography work for different publications.
Wow. That's so cool. Like, that's an incredible path to your start in wildlife photography and videography and getting that degree. But I have a question. So what are some of the difficulties that you have encountered as an underwater videographer and photographer, and how did you overcome those challenges?
I think the trickiest thing is that when you're working underwater, you have such a limited time. It's not like when you're topside and you can play around with your camera settings, or you can sneak up on your species or wait for hours. You have to be very reactive in the moment. So it's really important that you know your camera inside and out, so that when those moments kind of present themselves to you, you can capture them. But the other thing is that being underwater needs to feel second nature. You can't be somebody who is underwater thinking the entire time, oh my God, I'm underwater. How am I going to stay alive? What does all this stuff do? You have to kind of really trust your equipment and trust yourself to keep yourself alive, so that you can be spending the majority of your time actually focusing on the work that you have to do rather than staying alive. So huge amounts of practice. It's like, even at the moment, I'm currently waiting for some shoots to go out, but I'm diving in the quarries in England every weekend. I did a horrible dive in the centre of London last week, which is not somewhere anyone wants to go diving. But it's just to keep those skills as fresh as possible, so that when the next expedition comes up, it means that I'm never going to lose those motor skills, and can very much so focus on the project at hand and make sure that I get the shot when it comes up.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think, based on what you were saying, like kind of being able to pivot and think on your feet, I think those are just kind of like qualities that you have to have as a scientist overall, right? Like, I think a lot of us kind of get used to trial and error and failure and falling and getting back up again and doing it over and over again. So yeah, thinking about that and even how it works underwater is fascinating. So thank you for that. And also kind of staying on the theme of imagery. You've traveled to a lot of places, you've captured a lot of things. What is the most fascinating thing that you've captured, or what is your favorite thing that you love to capture?
It's a really tricky one. I think in terms of my favorite thing to capture, I absolutely love working with sharks. They always surprise me and they're always that little bit unpredictable, and you get those kind of certain characters that come through as certain individuals, and you can know a species in and out and know roughly its behavior to the point where you kind of pick up on cues and you can get a sense of what they're going to do. But then there's always that one rogue one that just goes against everything that you expected. So they're always a lot of fun to work with and keep me on my toes and keep me thinking. And I think going back to what you're saying about kind of being able to pivot and thinking on your feet with those shots, is that one of the things I love about sharks is that there's so many different ways you can photograph them. And I think that a lot of the imagery that we see is often very much so shark, center frame, high, glossy, beautiful. But something that I've been playing more and more with my imagery is kind of thinking about that negative space and what is the story that I want to tell through that image? Is it just going to be a photo of a shark, or is this going to be a story about shark finning? is this going to be a story that's about depleting shark numbers? And actually kind of taking the science and the conservation aspect into consideration when I'm in those moments can hugely impact how I photograph the species. So it might mean that actually I want to have the fin in perfect focus and everything else a blur because I want to show that that's the most important part of the shark. Or I might want to make the shark really small against an empty ocean and really focus on the big blue space to show that these numbers are going down. So I'm always trying to think about kind of how the species are changing and how different things might be coming up in the coming months or weeks regarding the conservation of them and how those images might play into that bigger picture when I'm working with them. So they're always a lot of fun to work with. But in terms of the most fascinating, I love corals. I think corals are they're just so magical, and a lot of people think they're probably one of the most boring because they're so stationary. But I think anyone who's worked with corals know that they are in no way boring. They're the most fascinating species with so many colors and just a lot of fun to work with. And I had the privilege of working with an amazing team out in Jamaica called the Alligator Head Foundation, who do a lot of coral restoration work. And that for me was by far the most fascinating project I've worked on, mainly because of the people. And I worked with some amazing individuals, scientists and fishermen, conservationists, and their passion for protecting their local environment was just amazing. And hearing all of their stories and how they became involved in the work and the amount of kind of trust they were putting in the corals to bring back these fish populations was amazing. And that was by far for me one of the most fascinating projects I've worked on.
Wow, that's amazing. And I want to, two things that you said that I do want to kind of stay on a little bit with our audience, because I know in terms of marine biology, you know, sharks are something that people think about when they think about underwater organisms. Not always corals, but even though they're sessile, I agree, like they're fascinating and beautiful. And then I also just want to highlight when you talked about working with communities, right? And, you know, BIMS is really all about building that inclusivity in marine science and doing community outreach and those things. So I do want to just stop and just, you know, make sure our audience catches on to some of the things that you highlighted. But on the page of sharks, you know, for our audience members, what's your favorite shark? Or sharks, can be plural. And what are like some of the behaviors that you've kind of witnessed with sharks? Because I know that there's a lot of people have the image of sharks as like, you know, the movie, right? And they're there to attack you and they're deadly and all of these things. So could you give us a little more insight into the behaviors that you've witnessed and what are some of your favorite sharks to photograph?
I'm afraid I'm a complete cliche. My favorite is the great white shark. It is the most well-known shark, as we all know. Jaws, I have to admit, is also my favorite movie, but I am rooting for the shark every time I watch it and if you watch it from that perspective, it's just a fantastic piece of cinema. So I am a big Jaws fan, which is possibly what's led me into my kind of love affair with sharks as well. But in terms of actually spending time with them, I'm always amazed by watching people's reactions change on a boat when they actually encountered them for themselves the first time. And you get a lot of people who will kind of go out on these shark diving expeditions and they'll be egged on by their mates to be out there diving with the sharks. And you can see they don't want to be there. And it's very much they're facing their fear situation, a bit like skydiving. But what you realize is that actually once they go down, the first thing that almost everyone says when they come up is, wow, they're so beautiful. And they are absolutely stunning. And they have this amazing presence in the water that I find mind-blowing. And they they cruise through the water with a presence that no other species I've encountered does. They're so sure of themselves. And they just circle you in a way that's just this quiet confidence that I aspire to have. And they're amazing to watch. And I've actually seen one of the things that I found really interesting with them is when you see multiple sharks interact. And it's amazing to see this kind of hierarchy that takes place when you have one great white that approaches the other, and you'll see them size each other up. And then you'll see the smaller one normally duck down and go lower. And it's like, oh no, she's defended her turf. And it's just amazing to kind of see all of these quiet little nuances between the two of them and how they interact. And when another one comes in, and they're so fascinating to observe. in terms of negative interactions and the kind of the Jaws theme tune and the fin approaching slowly from the distance, I haven't been so lucky as to observe that quite yet. Every time I'm watching them, I'm waiting for the music to start, but I have not seen a single negative interaction. I've only seen these incredible, majestic creatures that I feel very lucky to work with.
Wow. So that's really awesome. I have yet to go diving with sharks, and it is on my bucket list. But my next question is, so you talked about doing some work in Jamaica, and Jamaica is absolutely gorgeous. Where is your favorite dive spot?
My favorite dive spot. I have to say, unfortunately, it's not Jamaica. I love Jamaica with all my heart. My family, I'm half Jamaican, so it's somewhere that I'm very, very close to in that sense. And I always feel just it's a very special place to me. But the coral reefs, unfortunately, are not in the condition they should be in. I hope that in 10, 20 years, Jamaica will be my favorite spot to dive because they are doing some fantastic restoration work. But at the moment, possibly one of my favorite spots is out in Palau, which I think is one of the most incredible marine reserves in the world. There's some sites that you can dive there where you've just got huge schools of jacks that literally look like tornadoes in the water. And then you have sharks hunting amongst them, and then just huge spawning events. I saw hundreds and hundreds of bumphead parrotfish spawning in the water column there. And it's kind of, it's a site where things that in other locations around the world, I'd see one of them, and that would be the highlight of my week. In Palau, I would see 10, 20, 50, 100 of this one individual. And it's just, it's mind blowing. It does feel a little bit like you're stepping back in time, and like it's just this last little preserved section of our ocean. So I feel very lucky to have explored some of those places.
Wow. Okay, so I've added a new place to go diving on my bucket list. So what sparked your passion for ocean conservation? Because looking at your portfolio and all of the videos that you've done and the documentaries and some of the photography you've done, like you've really captured so much. And like we always hear about like your passion for photography leads into other things. And we've noticed that you do a lot of ocean conservation work. So kind of what sparked that passion? Was it starting out in photography, or was it something else?
I think more than anything, it was my love of diving. I've been scuba diving since I was about 11, which is super young. I'm from a diving family. So my dad was a dive master. And when I was much younger, I used to hang out at his dive club when he was teaching, and often jump in the pool and play with his gear. And for me, kind of learning to dive was very much waiting to be the right age to finally qualify and get in the water. But I think I grew up so much hearing so many fantastic stories from my dad and from his friends, because I grew up in that kind of diving community about all of these amazing places. And I think like so many people our age, I was always told that one day I'd get my chance to go and see these places. And then my bucket list was constantly growing. I'd hear all these stories. I'd add another place to the list, add another place to the list. This is another place I need to go. And actually, I realized that their places are changing so rapidly. And by the time I was actually visiting a lot of them, they were already gone. And I would go on a dive that'd be a dive that I'd been waiting for my entire life, and come up only to hear other divers on the boat go, "Oh, should have seen it 10 years ago." And it was so frustrating to constantly hear that over and over again. And actually now there's sites that I've returned to that I dived back when I was 12 and I dive now. And I can see the change. I can see the decline in the fish. I can see the change in the color of the corals. And there's something really concerning about when you can see that direct change yourself. And it's no longer something that you're reading about in a research paper or you're hearing about in a documentary. It's something that you're witnessing firsthand. And I now go on dives, and it's very rare that I can ever go on a dive where I don't come across plastic. I don't come across pollution of some kind. I'm always having to dive with a bag so that I can just collect trash. And it's like when you start to count more trash than you do fish, you realize there's something that's really wrong with this ecosystem. So for me, it was very much so the fact that I love these ecosystems. I love exploring them. Diving is one of my favorite things to do. And I was watching that ecosystem being destroyed. So I felt that I had to do something about it. And I think the diving community is so large and so global that we should absolutely be utilizing them as a strength for ocean conservation.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And yeah, that's really powerful. And yeah, totally agree with, kind of it's an overlap between like your passion for photography, videography, all of that, but also helping to solve one of the biggest global issues that we have in humanity with like ocean plastics and littering and all of those things. So yeah, for the audience out there, you can combine your love for the ocean with humanity because they are definitely connected and intertwined. Um, and staying in alignment with ocean conservation, you volunteered quite a bit with, ocean conservation groups and things like that. A lot of which do kind of put women at the center of ocean conservation and amplifying the voices of women. So my question to you is, how important do you think it is for women to be a part of conservation, or particularly ocean conservation issues?
I think it's essential. I think that when you're dealing with an issue of the scale, and it's so global, you need absolutely every voice at the table. You need every community, every person in that community to feel empowered and to be able to share their views and to be able to have these discussions, because it's the only way we're going to find solutions. And my approach for any kind of conservation, I think you have to look at it from a community level. You need to look at that local population and what's best for them. There's no one model fits all when you're talking about ocean conservation, because we are, as people, are so unique and all the different communities are unique. And I think having women have a say at those discussions and have an active role in conservation will allow us to hear more of those voices and understand those perspectives. And I think it's only when we understand all of these global perspectives that we'll be able to actually come up with effective solutions, because the idea that we can separate ocean conservation from people, to me, just doesn't make sense. We are such a global species and we have such a huge impact on our oceans. So any conservation method that we use, we have to be taking people into consideration. We have to be taking culture into consideration. We have to be taking resources into consideration. We have to be taking into consideration people's economic backgrounds and what they've been used to. And I mean, that was one of the things that I think really stood out to me with the project out in Jamaica, was their approach to working with the fishing communities and working with the local community when they were discussing these conservation issues, was to really stop and listen. You can't always assume that you know what's best for somebody else. You have to make sure that you hear them. And for those communities, a lot of it was that people had a connection to the ocean. They didn't want to be put into some other job where they can have an income. They wanted to maintain their relationship with the ocean. They loved the ocean. They were just fishermen. So it was just about actually finding different methods. And I think that that's why it's so important that we listen to so many people, and women especially have a huge role in that.
Yes, totally agree. And again, I really do love, making sure that we are inclusive, that we are doing like community-based research and ensuring that like communities are represented as we are moving towards conservation efforts, policy decisions, whatever that may look like. I always say representation matters, and people who make decisions need to represent the communities that are impacted by those decisions. And so for our audience members, let's say if you're not necessarily connected to a conservation group or so, what do you think, like one thing that anyone could kind of do that could help work towards ocean conservation?
I think the most important thing is that you educate people around you. We all have such different networks and we all reach people in different ways. So making sure that you educate your friends, you educate your family. And if it's something that you're passionate about, making sure that passion shows. And something else I think is really important is to think about where your talents are. And so often I think we have scientists and we tell them that they need to be fantastic science communicators. They don't necessarily. They can be just a fantastic scientist, but they need to work with a great science communicator. And a lot of it is all about collaboration. So figure out where your talents are. And if you feel like there's an area where you're lacking, find someone who you can collaborate with. There are so many fantastic young filmmakers, young photographers who would be desperate to work more closely with scientists, with conservationists to help share those stories. And I think it's really important that we utilize them. So, and that's a fantastic way to kind of broaden your message and help to inspire others, is by creating fantastic content. But yeah, don't ever feel like you have to do that independently. I think collaborating is so important.
So you mentioned collaboration and finding people to help you communicate your science while you can just be the scientist. In your opinion, what is required to build inclusivity in marine science other than these collaborations? Like how can we become a more inclusive field?
It's a tricky one. I think representation is so important, and it's a part of the reason why I've always been so vocal about the work that I do over social media and in the projects that I made. And I ran my Instagram account for years without putting my name or my face to it as a completely anonymous account, because I thought that would take away from how seriously people would take my work. And it was only actually when I was I think I was probably about 20, when I was like, do you know what? It was a friend of mine who was like, I feel like you're kind of a big part of that, and you should be owning it and doing it. And that was when I kind of changed my format. And all of a sudden it got so much more attention. And a part of that was because I was showing like, no, this isn't one type of person. It isn't always a white man from Bristol, which is always doing the wildlife photography. It can absolutely be someone from all different backgrounds. And I think there's huge value in seeing all of those different voices. And that you inspire more young people. And for me, growing up, I didn't have a lot of role models that I identified with, especially going into the space. And I remember even in university when I said that I wanted to work as a researcher on wildlife documentaries, when we were talking about what's going to be our first job coming out of our degrees. And my instructor was just like, that's not a job. And it was just like, oh, no, I think it is. And having those back and forth discussions. And actually, it's just, you have to think about that exposure to those different communities. And this is why it's so important that we kind of show people that these roles are out there and there is a huge variety of people that do them, so that the next generation coming in can feel like, oh, they feel empowered to also be able to pursue wildlife documentary filmmaking, or to feel like they can make a living out of wildlife photography. And I think so often we're told these things are pipe dreams, but the reality is that if you put the work in and you do you really push yourself, it's absolutely achievable. But I think kind of having that level of belief in yourself can be really difficult if you never see anyone that you identify with in any of those roles or being successful. So it's really important that we increase that. And that can be in a variety of ways, through social media and doing more campaigning and highlighting the people who are working in these industries and what an average day for them is, but also reaching out to the schools directly, giving talks online, or even just like taking the time to look over someone's CV, give them advice about that career, that job they have coming up, providing internship opportunities. All of those things are so important when it comes to investing in a community that have maybe been underrepresented in any of these fields. I think they make a huge difference.
So I actually want to pivot a little bit and kind of go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. You talked about your apprenticeship. Can you actually give us a little bit more details about that? Like, I guess you told us a little bit about how it came to be, but can you tell us your experience and just all the nitty-gritty details about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked with the Vidman Project on a couple of different expeditions, and one of them was to, I apologize in advance, I'm definitely going to pronounce this wrong, but the Revillagigedo archipelago, which is off Mexico, the Socorro Islands, San Benedito, and Oca Partida. And they're three incredible seamounts that are known as the Galapagos of the Pacific Ocean. So, no, sorry, Galapagos of Mexico. That's what I meant to say. And it is the most amazing location where you just have incredible pelagic life migrating around these different seamounts. So oceanic mantas that are the biggest oceanic mantas I've ever seen in my entire life. Some of them reaching a wingspan of almost 7 meters. And they literally look like aircraft coming into land. And the first time I saw one, I thought it was a whale, genuinely. And then it was just like, no, that is just a giant manta ray that's bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. And we were there doing biopsies of scalloped hammerheads. So we did a lot of work kind of around diving around these seamounts where the scalloped hammerheads were passing through, collecting biopsies and taking ID photos. And we were also biopsying the mantas that are passing through as well. So it was a team of people working on freediving, and I was doing a mix of freediving and scuba. I'm a terrible freediver. I much prefer to take my time scuba diving. So I was pretty useless free diving, but I would help out with the samples and things like that. So it was quite an interesting one for me because it was my first kind of more hands-on field job after completing my degree. And I found myself really having to try and balance the science side of things with the photography and the media side of things. And I was there very much so to be a research assistant, but I was more involved in vlogging and blogging and taking photos and taking videos and trying to find a way to kind of make the entire expedition more relatable. But I think I also felt that I was in a very privileged position where I had this opportunity to go out into the middle of the ocean, 2 days offshore, and experience these incredible things. And I personally felt that that was something that I needed to share, and not just in a way that's, hey, look, I'm on vacation here, but much more in a, no, this is what it means to work in these environments. This is how it actually happens. These are the things that you might see. And I think that it becomes a really valuable educational resource for other young people who are in my position, looking at getting into research and actually understanding how all of this work, all the amount of work that goes into protecting these species. So it was a really interesting project, and from all of that tagging data, they could then gain a better understanding of how these sharks are migrating around the area and draw out a better idea of how we can protect these species that are so vulnerable. And as a result of all of the research that was taking place around that region, I think it was about a year later, it became one of the biggest marine reserves in Mexico, and it's now a fantastic protected area, mainly due to the fact that it protects so many of these incredible pelagic species. And the other expedition I did with them was out to Bimini in the Bahamas, where we were working with great hammerheads. And that was a fantastic project because it was looking a lot at the relationship between those that have been more habituated and those that were still doing these much larger migrations and weren't being habituated by the hand feeding. And we were looking at how these different sharks were migrating around the area and how they were using different parts of this land. And it's just really interesting because you basically, from all of that tagging data, you can gain a better understanding of their land use and therefore draw better conclusions on how to protect them. And through that, I was able to do some fantastic photography of freedivers lying down next to great hammerheads and get super close. I had a couple nurse sharks stuck onto my dome port, which was not ideal, causing lots of scratches, but it was a great project.
That sounds pretty incredible. You've done some amazing dives. You've done a ton of dives, and you've seen so much on these dives. And one thing that you also mentioned in a previous answer was you've seen this decline of organisms in the ocean with your own eyes. So what do you think this means for the future? And realistically, do you think that we can reverse this decline?
It depends on what day you ask me. There's definitely some days where I think, like so many of us, I feel completely defeated and like we are fighting a battle that we're never going to win, and that people aren't going to listen, and there's too much money to be gained from harvesting from our oceans for us to make a positive impact. But the long term of that, of course, is that there's going to be nothing to harvest, and it makes no economic sense to carry on impacting our oceans the way that we are. So we need to have action. I think the interesting thing is that we are at a time where we know exactly what the problems are. We know what the solutions are. We know what to do. It is just a matter of action. And I do think that the younger generation we're seeing now, they're not sitting around and going to just take it. Like, they're absolutely here to fight for what they think is right, and they're here to fight for their environment. And I think that there is such a frustration of feeling like you're being denied the opportunity to have a future. And with our oceans, that is the case for so many young people, and even people like myself. It's like when you've had that taste of what it could be, it just doesn't sit right that could be it. And I personally, I don't want to see our oceans conserved. I want to see them restored. I want to see how they were 10, 20 years ago. I have no interest in conserving what we have right now. I don't think it's nearly good enough. I think the thing that we need to get past is the idea that the oceans of our future will ever be like our oceans of the past. I think they have changed, and there's nothing we can do about that. But what we can do is potentially build something better. And that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time, a lot of dedication. But I do think that we're a generation that is incredibly innovative, incredibly passionate. And I think that especially with lockdown and everything else that's happened with COVID, we have a newfound appreciation for these natural spaces. and the wild therapy that they bring and how vital they are to us and to our own survival and to our own mental health. And I think that's you're starting to see a big change in the way that people think about these ecosystems and the way that we appreciate them and the way that we interact with them. But we do need to put more pressure on government and on big companies to really make a difference, because I would love to think that us alone, being just passionate marine biologists, would do it, but we don't. We need to gather the support of so many others. And that is part of the reason why I love film and why I love photography, is that it allows me to connect with people way beyond just the marine space. And I can reach the homes and the hearts of people who maybe have never been to the ocean or never shown an interest before. But if you tell those stories right, you can connect them and you can make them care, even though it wasn't an interest they previously had. And that's what we need to do, is we need to think more and more about ways that we can reach audiences outside of our typical audience and ensure that they as well are kind of joining that fight to protect and restore our oceans.
Well said. Well said. That is, yes, well said. So even, based on what you were saying in terms of getting everyone, I like to say a seat at the table, but I'm kind of away from a seat at the table, like building your own tables, being on a yacht, whatever that looks like, as long as it's collaboration. And a lot of that is based on building inclusivity in science. When I hear you say government, policy, hold people accountable, to me, that's really putting all the players together. And that means diversity. That literally means building that inclusivity. That means diversity in expertise, diversity in experiences, diversity with, whether you're a videographer, filmmaker, someone who does eDNA like myself, whatever that is, students, senior leaders, government, all of that. And so that's what BIMS is all about, bringing all those players to the table. And I love that you said moving towards restoration. And one, as I heard you talk about your social media and your kind of choice to include your face and more about yourself to kind of build that inclusivity, to say that marine science is not limited to an old white man, right? You can look like me and be in this body and contribute to a global issue. So love that, love that. And with that being said, what is, I would say, your favorite research project that you've done? And I'm saying this because, again, we often think as Black women or people of color in marine science that we solely want to have conversations about diversity in marine science, but we are scientists. We do research, we go out into the field, we have degrees, we have expertise. So what is your favorite research project that you've worked on?
It's a tricky one. I've worked on some things recently that I'm not allowed to talk about, but there's some really, really fascinating stuff going on at the moment. I think my favorite one that I can talk about would be definitely the shark tagging work, just because the process of collecting that data was so much fun. And it's just, being able to go up against sharks and to collect that data and see where it's going, and then to be able to track sharks globally is just amazing. I love satellite data, and I love kind of watching. I've got a book called Where the Animals Go, which you might have heard of. It's a fantastic book, and it just tells the stories of species through tracking data. And you can see how they move across the globe and the stories of all the different individuals. And I think for me, when I'm working on one of those tracking research projects, that's what I'm seeing as a filmmaker and as a storyteller. I'm seeing the individual story of that individual shark and where it went, and wondering about kind of its own life. And I think it's kind of when I put things into that perspective that I really that passion is ignited again. And I'm just so fascinated by that ecosystem. So I love tagging projects. I think for me, there's just there's something really interesting about those.
So we have to know, and I'm sure our viewers are dying to know, this is a two-part question. First, what does a day in your life look like when you're, on the water? And then second, what does a day in your life look like when you don't have a photography or videography event occurring?
Should you want to hear the fun one first or the not so fun one?
You can choose.
So when I'm out filming, like when I was working on my student documentary, they were long days. Sometimes I would get up before sunrise so that I can go and set up a time lapse. I would start the time lapse running while I was getting coffee, and then I would come back, break down the time lapse, meet the boat as the sun's up, go out on a dive with the researchers and film all of their research work underwater for a couple of different for a dive. And then I would do when they're back on the boat, we would film reactions. So even when you're in the surface interval, you're still talking about it, filming the different things. Then you're going back down for another dive, coming back up, getting back to shore, setting up for interviews, doing interviews for sometimes 2 or 3 hours, shooting cutaways around the research center or around the location. So just kind of beautiful scenic shots that we can cut with all of the other interview aspect. Then shooting drone work in the afternoon. And then on that one, we would then also do then a sunset time lapse. And then I was going out at 3 a.m. to try and film turtles nesting in the beach, and then getting home and then having to download all of my rashes and then ready to do the same thing the next day. So pretty much no sleep at all, constantly. And I think that's the thing with the type of filmmaking that I often do, is that I am the camera operator, I'm the director, I'm the presenter, I'm the writer, and I'm also the person who's doing the offload data, and I'm doing all of the editing and all of the sound equipment. So you're constantly jumping from job to job, trying to keep everything running. So it's pretty manic, but it's so rewarding, mainly because if you can really get that connection with your contributors and you can build those relationships. I get to hear scientists talking about the thing that they love more than anything with so much passion that it is the most infectious feeling. And hopefully I get to carry that across on camera to then share it with other people so they can share that passion over and over and over again, inspiring hundreds of people, which is my favorite thing about filmmaking. So that would be a day in the life when I'm actually out on location, which is where I would love to be all the time. But unfortunately, another aspect of that is research. So when I am not out running around the world with cameras and backpacks and drones, I am normally at a computer screen speaking to hundreds and hundreds of scientists. I have a spreadsheet that is about 10 pages long of scientists that I call. I apologize. I'm sure there's some scientists listening to this who I have harassed by email to chat about your papers. But I actually love that part as well. I think I love marine biology. So I love being able to talk to scientists about their newest research, about what they're working on now. And I'm the one who comes in with the most obscure questions that they never expected to hear, that goes right down to the nitty gritty, because I'm always thinking about it from a film or a photography perspective, which is really interesting because I think it makes a lot of the scientists kind of think about their research work through a different lens. And we have some really interesting and fascinating conversations. So I spend a huge amount of time on Zoom calls with scientists, just going over the research. And then I also spend a lot of time talking to divers who maybe have dived around those species. And then I'll speak to another scientist who maybe works on the same species on the other side of the world, and draw parallels between them. And it's quite interesting because at times I find that I'm having conversations that are kind of drawing together the dots on research that actually the scientists haven't had those conversations themselves yet, because I'm the one who's kind of looking for a story and really kind of investigating the research in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do if you're just focused on your data. So I love that aspect when you kind of feel like things are coming together and you have ideas and the scientists get excited and you're coming up with ways and how you can document them for the first time and bring new science into it as well. And then as well as that, I read tons and tons of research papers. So I'm normally the one on ResearchGate sending 100 requests to read all of your papers. And I find that actually it's through reading all of those papers and speaking to all those scientists that you can make a good film, or you can do a good job with that photography assignment. And the research is so important, and it takes up 10 times more time than the actual filming process, because the worst thing you could possibly do would be to get out to a location and be there at the wrong time because the currents aren't correct, or because there's a lunar cycle that's involved, or because there's been a crash on a foundation fish species recently and you didn't realize how that would impact that entire ecosystem. So there's a huge level of research that goes into understanding that entire ecosystem, that entire coastline, and how it's going to behave, and basically narrowing down that perfect window to be able to film and to be able to do that photography. And then as well as that, gaining the trust of the scientists, because often I want to really complicate their research, but for a really good cause.
No, that's great. And I love that, for our viewers, they get to see, again, because I always say that like marine biology is the sexy science, right? Like I call it's the sexiest of the science, right? Like you get to travel, you get to be out on the water, and even some of the things that you said, it's like you are able to capture, like, yes, there's beauty in this, but there's also the conservation, there's the storytelling of this, there's the connecting with humanity, and there's also the hardcore research that goes into it, right? The persistence, the determination, the ability to pivot. So although we're sexy scientists, we're still, we do our research, and we're serious about doing our research, okay?
I don't know what kind of science you're doing. I'm normally covered in snot and just like I get out from a dive and I look a mess. There's nothing sexy about what's happening down there.
Look, I'm sexy when I put on the swimsuit and take the picture beforehand, but when I come out, I don't take none of those pictures. I don't even, most often, and it's not because I'm not looking sexy, but it's because you're exhausted, right? Like you're tired, you're swimming against currents, you've been out there all day. In my case, I did a lot of research in Hawaii, collecting sea slugs for marine drug discovery, or sometimes I'm on a boat for 18 days, a month at a time. I'm tired. I don't always look sexy, but overall, marine science to me is the sexy science. You get to travel and go to awesome places and just see beautiful creatures, but it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. So one of our viewers wanted to know, as you're kind of talking about your journey in science and all the great and wonderful things that you do, how are you funded for this? There is like kind of the traditional academia route where you get grants, or you might work for a foundation or so on. But if people, wanted to go into this career, like how do they get funding or find funding to do these things?
Big mix. So I do passion projects, which are the ones that I personally love, and I'm going to make them regardless of if I have funding, but cross my fingers that some comes through. But you work on them over a long period of time and you hope for the best. So my 25 Days Between Us, which was my student film, that was a passion project. I funded it partly through GoFundMe, and I put together kind of a fundraising video and said, here's what I want to do. Could anyone help me? And was very fortunate to receive some funding toward it. But I also put a lot of my own money in because it was something that I wanted to make and I wanted to invest my time into. And for me, that felt like I was investing in my future and it was worth it. So I did put a lot of the money in myself to make that documentary, but I was able to go on to lots of film festivals. And as a result of that, I was able to land funding for other projects. So it was worth it. It did mean that it was taking a gamble early on, but it then meant that I was sponsored by Panasonic to make a short film for them, which I was able to do something all about my local coastlines and talking about kind of the importance of connecting with nature for mental health. So that was a fantastic campaign that I was able to work on. And I work with lots of other brands as well. So sometimes I look for companies who I ethically align with and see if we can do something together. So for them, it's advertising, but for me, I add a conservation spin and I will try and make it into my own thing, but it means that it can be funded by a company. So that's another way of doing things. But I also work for bigger productions. So I'm currently working on a big Netflix production, which I've been working on for the past year and a half, and I'll be working on for the next 3 years. And that's kind of a much bigger scale production where I work as a researcher. So for that kind of thing, it's obviously funded by the production company. So, but in my spare time, I continue to do these more independent projects with smaller companies and smaller collaborations. But there's also a lot of grants out there. So you can have a look and there's all sorts of different filmmaking grants that go out covering different areas. There's also awards that you can win. So once you've made the film, you can enter it into film competitions to gain money back. And also for screenings. So the student film that I funded myself, I've then gone on to have it screened at different places around the world. And I often get screening feedback. So you sometimes make your money back past tense. It's not an ideal way to be entering the system, but it does work and it does pay back slowly. And the other way of doing things is, I've forgotten what I was going to say. does that filming. And you can also go about it by, oh, I've completely lost my train of thought. But yeah, there's lots of different film grants out there.
So we have another viewer question from one of our favorite budding scientists, Addison. She wants to know where we can watch your films.
My film, My 25 Days Between Us, is available on my website, which is www.inkacresswell.com. There's a little tab that says film. And there's also a few little shorts that are on my Instagram. And there's also some other projects that I've been working on that will be coming out next, actually possibly on Oceans Day, fingers crossed, which is a collaboration with the Marine Conservation Society. So I've been doing some work with them, which is much more kind of aimed at kids, educating them about their local environment. So that's the other method for funding your films, is working directly with conservation organizations. So sometimes conservation organizations get grants towards education, and you can partner with them to use them to make your own documentaries.
Got it. And we'll be sure to share that information on our BIMS sites too for our visitors, so they can easily access your website and some of the things that you just mentioned to watch your films. So with all that you've done, as we kind of wrap up, what would you say is the most rewarding aspect of your career?
I think for me personally, the most rewarding aspect is when I get young girls reaching out to me saying they're inspired, that they want to do what I do. And I think that every time I get that, it's just like, oh, I've done something right. it feels good. And it's like, it's one of those ones where it's not going to get me any awards or kind of get me recognition. But for me personally, I think knowing that when I was growing up, I didn't feel like I had any role models or anyone that I could look up to, being able to act as that person for other people, yeah, that feels good.
Yeah, that does really feel good. Like all the awards in the world can't make up for just knowing that you've made an impact in somebody's life that looks like you, and then that you're encouraging them to, follow this path that wasn't necessarily there for them 10, 15 years ago. So if you could leave the viewers with one piece of advice regarding underwater photography, videography, wildlife photography, and videography, what would it be?
Get out there and start making films. I think it's so important that you don't wait for opportunities to come to you, that you have to go and make them, and you learn so much by doing. So even if it is something that maybe you don't think like, oh, it's not a great subject, but it's local to you, get out there and start working on it, because you will learn so much just from that process of setting up equipment. Interview your friends, interview your mum. Like there's so many people you can interview, and it's gaining those skills that are going to be so essential in the long run. But for me, I especially found that every time I make a film, I approach it slightly differently, because I've learned from the last one I've made. And especially taking something all the way through to the edit, once you've started that whole process of making an entire film, it impacts the way that I look at things visually, about how I take those images, and also like the storytelling behind them. It's like what I was saying about how you photograph the shark to be able to portray a certain message. That only comes from me writing so many different articles about shark conservation and working on so many different conservation different projects, that I start to kind of bring that more and more into my photography and into my photography style. The other thing I would recommend is, if you're a complete novice and you're just starting out with something like underwater photography, try and imitate other photographers that you admire. Have a look at, and like there's a fantastic competition called the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition. And they have the most incredible photographers who do some amazing techniques for their photography. And they will tell you exactly the shutter, the aperture, the camera they were using. And by kind of looking at those images and learning how to imitate them, you can learn so much about how that camera works and how you can photograph certain subjects. And then you can incorporate that into your own style as you find and develop your own style of photography. And don't be afraid to be creative with it and try something different. Just because you haven't seen images that look like yours before doesn't mean yours aren't any good. It just means you're doing something new.
Thank you for that. That is, that's really exciting to hear. And, something that we've been thinking about working on, and I've been kind of helping to lead is, as a person who does innovation at BIMS, is creating a BIMS film and really telling our story, right? Like when we had BIMS week, one of the things that was just really successful was the BIMS roll call, and seeing that there were so many people of color in marine science all over the world doing amazing research, doing things in policy and government and decision making, was just so beautiful to see. And that's something that we definitely want to capture. We want to be able to tell our story and our journey through film. So again, we are really honored to have you here today. And it is so encouraging to see someone like you talking about what you have done and what you are going to continue to do, but most importantly, just do it. Like you said, get out there and do it, because there's so many stories that need to be told. There's so many images that need to be captured. And there is an ocean that needs saving, right? So now is the time. So thank you for that. And as we are wrapping up, I just want to quickly kind of go back to, in the beginning, we talked about, we threw out a question to our viewers, excuse me, regarding like, what is their best method of capturing the ocean, whether that's photography, writing, videography, whatever that looks like. And we did get some feedbacks from our viewers that I just want to quickly highlight. And we did this via Twitter and Instagram. For the most part, a lot of the consensus was on writing, but specifically poetry. And when we asked this question, we did throw out, some forms of capturing the ocean, but we didn't say poems or poetry. So we thought it was really interesting that a lot of the viewers talked about poetry and how you can really like capture the ocean through like writing these eloquent poems. Also, photography was a big one, photos. And then also we got storytelling through videos, which is, again, really awesome and interesting. And we didn't, again, we said photography, videography. We didn't necessarily say films or poetry, but those things came out a lot. So to me, that simply means that we need to move forward with the BIMS film and telling our story and capturing the beauty of the ocean, but also conservation and making sure that we include the people who depend on the ocean. So with that, I will stop there and say thank you again for joining us. And we have a few more minutes. So if there's any last things that you want to leave with our viewers before we wrap up.
And now I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And to anyone listening, just, pick up a camera, go take a photo, take a film, make a film, anything.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. This was awesome. I was behind here like, oh my gosh, like I'm so excited. I want to go diving in Palau, like sign me up. How do we get that going on? But just thank you for your honest conversation, because as we're talking about representation does matter. And to have someone out doing wildlife photography, doing underwater videography, just really bringing us into films, it's just so amazing to see. So I'm just so grateful that we have this community here at Black in Marine Science where we can find folks who look like us finally and say, hey, we are here. And it doesn't matter, maybe you're the only person, hopefully you're not, but it doesn't matter because we still have someone there, and now you can really just make that bridge for everyone else who wants to do this. So I'm just so excited to just have you in this community and to really be able to highlight your work.